Untitled Church. If I haven't met you before, my name is Chris. We're so glad to have you with us wherever you're joining us this day. Maybe you're gathering with us online, watching this video today and worship with us through that community. Maybe you're at one of our campuses. We're so thankful that you're a part of the work that God's doing here at Untitled Church. Are you ready for some good news? When you consistently expect that things will go poorly, it breeds worry. What if you could set your mind on peace and expect God's victory? One of the fun things to do with my kids is to see their expectations about what life will be like once they move out of our house. For instance, if I'm to tell my kids tonight when I get home that it's time for them to go to bed, one of them will certainly say to me, when I grow up, I'm going to stay up all night. If I tell them at dinner to eat all of their green beans, one of them will surely say, when I have kids, I'm going to let them eat whatever they want. Or maybe when I tell them that they've had enough treats for the day, they'll say, I'm going to have ice cream for dinner every single night when I'm an adult. When I tell them to clean their room with some reasonable expectation that they'll keep up their own stuff, one of them will say, when I get older, no one's ever going to tell me what to do. When I say we're not going to have our friends over today, they say, when I become an adult, I'm going to spend every day, all day with my friends. The lesson for my kids is don't grow up. It's a trap. You know, expectations are a peculiar thing. Much of our experiences in the world are shaped by what we expect might happen. Think about first dates or going to see a movie or going on vacation. We have expectations about how those things might go. Thus, when a date is a disappointment or a movie is awful or it rains on our vacation, our expectation becomes worry. It is the circumstances of our lives that shape much of what we worry about. As we come to the ending weeks of this series on worry, I want to turn our attention today to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. It's found in Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6. I'm going to pick up reading in what is certainly the most famous verses about worry in all of Scripture. Matthew chapter 6. Therefore I tell you, verse 25, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into their barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And which of you are being anxious can add even a single hour to his span of life? Then he concludes this section in verse 34. Therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Worry is a thief. Dr. Charles Mayo, who started the esteemed Mayo Clinic, once said, worry affects the circulation, the heart, the glands, and the whole nervous system. He continued, I have never known anyone who died from overwork, but many have died from doubt. Worry, anxiety will steal the joy and expectations of our lives. And so we are instructed by Jesus here in Matthew 6, and which of you by being anxious can add a single hour to his span of life? When you hear things like that from Jesus, I think our instinct is to say, but you don't know my story. I mean, you don't know my circumstances. You tell me not to worry about today, but how can we not worry about all of the things in our lives when we look at all of the circumstances that surround them? Israel's history was filled with moments where the circumstances would naturally build worry and anxiety. In a really interesting pattern of Israel's layout of their land and the land that they were given by their God, you see that throughout the book of Genesis, it appears that the Israelites are quite content with Yahweh being their God. If you follow the pattern of those stories, if you follow the ways in which God unveils his graciousness, his covenants to his people, they seem quite content. This contentment, even in their own sin, continues through the stories that we are familiar with. Adam and the fall and the flood and the Tower of Babel, and then the patriarchs of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. All of those stories, we find that although they are rebelling against God at times, they aren't ever asking that they'll have another king. Yet, as we turn from Genesis into Exodus, something changes in the heart of the Israelites. Maybe it was when they were in Egypt, they saw the grandeur of the Pharaoh's temples. Maybe they saw the wealth of Egypt and it changed their heart. But as we transition back from Egypt, back to the land of promise, as Moses leads the people back to the precipice of the promised land, and Joshua leads them into the promised land, their hearts begin to wonder. What would it be like if we had a king like these other nations? They were surrounded by the Amalekites and the Philistines and the Midianites, and they saw that they had human kings that had physical courts that they could enter into and petition those kings and those leaders for the good of the people. There's an interesting gap in the desire and history of Israel. Moses goes to the precipice, Joshua leads them in, and as Joshua leads them in, they are given this warning. Deuteronomy 30, see, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments of God, of the Lord your God, that I have commanded you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to make possession of it. So this is the warning that God gives the Israelites as Joshua is leading them into the promised land. As Joshua's story comes to an end in Joshua 24, we read this about their days under Joshua's leadership. And the people said to Joshua, the Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey. They've done it. Like the thing that Joshua had asked of them, the thing that God had commanded of them, they had gotten victory over. Their heart had turned towards God. Leading up to this, we had seen all of the ways that their disobedience had led them into spiritual and physical captivity. And Joshua seems to have provided a way for them to come into alignment with God's best for them. It lasts one generation. One generation of obedience. And between the time of Joshua and the time of the first king Saul, God provides leadership over the Israelites to keep the promise that he had made to Abraham, that he would make them a great nation, that he would multiply them, that he would bless them like the stars in the sky. And during that season, he led them with judges. Judges are an act of God's faithfulness to keep his promises to Abraham. Over a period of 350 years, between Joshua and Saul, there are 14 judges and one cycle of behavior: rebellion, punishment, and deliverance. You know their names: Samson and Deborah, and today Gideon. Gideon's story picks up in Judges chapter 6. Verse 1 we read, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian. 7 years. For 7 years, the Israelites were bordered by the Midianites. They raided their land, they destroyed their crops, they stole their livestock. People were taken into captivity and murdered. And finally, the people call out to God for his mercy, and he answers. The story continues as it reads, the angel of the Lord came. This angel of the Lord comes and he selects a leader from among the Israelites to lead them back into obedience. And God, through this angel of the Lord, chooses Gideon. When we find Gideon at the beginning of his story, he was beating out wheat in the winepress, the scripture tells us. Now, ordinarily, wheat would be beaten at the top of the hill. The hardest part about wheat was to sort out that which you would keep and bake, and that which would need to float away into the wind. And so they would beat the wheat at the top of the hill so that the winds of the valley would come and they would sweep away all of the chaff. But Gideon was afraid, and he was hiding in the bottom of this well press. He was hiding from the Midianites, afraid that they would come and do what they had done for the last 7 years. Steal his grain, kill his livestock, and maybe take him into captivity. And the angel of the Lord says to Gideon here, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." And while hiding, a man appears to Gideon and says, "You are a man of valor." And Gideon responds, "If the Lord is with us, why then has all of this happened to us? And where are all the wonderful deeds that our father recounted to us, saying, 'Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt?' But now the Lord has forsaken us and given us into the hands of Midian." 7 years is an enormously long time to be in a captivity. Maybe Gideon was the last one whose faith would have failed. But even at this point, Gideon, who God's going to call a mighty man of valor, he's given up that God will ever do anything for the people of Israel. God has surely this time turned his back on them. There is no patriarch, there is no judge, there is no king. And as he looks around, his brothers and sisters are being taken and destroyed, and their land and their animals being taken into another kingdom. And he says, "Listen, I have recounted the stories, not only in my own mind, but to those around me who doubt, of all the ways that God had provided for the people while they were in Egypt. Where is that God? Where is the God who led them out?" Gideon proves he is no warrior here. And he said to him, "Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." The irony of him saying, "Where is the God that led the people out of Israel with Moses?" When compared to what he's saying here, this is the same kind of language that Moses uses before the bush. "Who am I to be sent out?" Moses is of the tribe of Levite. And here we see that Gideon, it says he's from the tribe of Joseph or of Manasseh. He says, I'm not worthy to do it. I know that something needs to be done, but I'm not qualified to do the thing that God's calling me to do. And the angel responds, and the Lord said to him, "But I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man." Verse 21 of chapter 6, Gideon's going to ask for a sign. The angel of the Lord reaches out the tip of his staff and touches some unleavened cakes and some meat, and fire is going to come up out of a rock and consume it. When this happens, Gideon knows that he is in the presence of God, and he says, "Peace be with you, do not fear, for you shall not die." And Gideon believes it at this point. See, when he sees that he is in the presence of God, peace comes on him. Gideon's response later in chapter 6 is that the angel of the Lord tells him to return to his father's house and destroy the idols of Baal. This was always the problem for the Israelites. God would tell them to have no other God, have no graven image. In the very moment that God would turn his back and walk away, they would begin to build the very thing that God told them not to. And so Gideon goes to his father's house, where there is a statue, a monument, an altar to a foreign god. Now, this is the same thing that Solomon's going to do later. Solomon's going to allow the foreign nations to build altars to the foreign gods in the land of promise. And that's going to divide the kingdom north and south. This is a foretaste, a foreshadowing of that coming. And Gideon's still not brave. The scripture is going to tell us that though Gideon returns to his house to destroy this altar, he waits till it's at night when no one will see him do it. And he sneaks out and he tips over the altar to legally keep the command. But let's be honest, this wasn't the spirit of the command of the angel of the Lord. And now comes the big test. Gideon knows that the Midianites have 300,000 troops. 300,000 troops. And the angel tells him to call forth into Israel in any who are brave enough to fight on his behalf, that they should come and gather with him. And so Gideon makes his plea. He casts the vision to the Israelites, and 32,000 people come out. So we have 300,000 people compared to 32,000. But the angel of the Lord wants to leave no doubt. But Gideon doesn't know if he can trust him. And so they're having a back and forth debate about what he's to do and how he's to lead. And so he asks for another sign. This is the same angel of the Lord that took his spear and burnt up from the rock the meat and the unleavened bread. And now Gideon is going to ask of the angel that he do another miraculous sign and wonder. He says, on the first day, I'm going to go to sleep, and when I wake up, I'm going to lay this fleece on the ground. And when I wake up, I want the fleece to be wet, but the ground around it to be dry. So Gideon goes to bed, wakes up the next morning, and sure enough, that's what he finds. The fleece is wet, and the ground around it, the threshing floor, is dry. Gideon wonders if that was just some trick. Maybe it was just circumstances. So now he says, I'm going to go to bed again. And when I wake up the next day for day 2, I want the opposite to happen. I want the fleece to be dry and the floor around it to be wet. And so he goes to bed. He wakes up the next morning and he finds that. And so now the angel of the Lord says, I have proven that I will do exactly what I said I was going to do. I've proven that I have the authority from the God on high. And now I need you to do something. And Gideon says, okay, my 32,000 against their 300 seems insurmountable, but maybe you will gift them in such a way that each of my troops can take out 10 of their troops and we can win this battle. And the angel of the Lord says, send 29,000 of them home. Now we're 3,000 against 300,000. And the angel of the Lord looks out on the army of Israel and says, it's still too many. So won't you send another 2,700 home? So now it's 300 versus 300,000. And he says, I want you to take these 300 soldiers and I want you to divide them into 3 groups of 100. So at any given point, depending on where the 300,000 are trying to attack the vulnerability of Israel, it could be 300,000 against 100. God has shown up, both by the angel on the threshing floor, by with fire eating up the meat and the unleavened bread cakes, by showing that at God's design, that the fleece can be either dry or wet. And Gideon waits for the angel of the Lord to leave, and in the middle of the night, he sneaks into the enemy's camp. He wants to see if he can surmise what their plan of attack will be tomorrow. After all, if he's going to win, he's going to have to cheat. It's 300,000 against 300. And he hears 2 of the soldiers discussing a dream that one of the soldiers had. In that dream, a loaf of bread is rolling into the Midianite camp and destroying the tent. The other soldier interprets the dream and says that it is a promise that the Midianites will be destroyed. The next morning, Gideon gets up with a faith he never knew. He walks up to the top of the hill, raises his hands with his 300 troops behind him, and the 300,000 turn around and run away. Judges 8:28 says, so Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more. And the land had rest for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Immediately the people of Israel want to make Gideon their king. And they've never seen anything like this, like signs and wonders and the great Midianite army, all 300,000 of them fleeing, at Gideon simply raising his hands. And Gideon insists on the same truth that had led the people of Israel from the time of Adam and Eve until this moment in their history, said, we will have no God but Yahweh. In the New Testament, Gideon makes an appearance. In Hebrews 11, we read this, and what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, brought mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Samson's name, David's name, Samuel's name. Gideon's name is not like the others. I mean, we read Gideon's story. Not only did he have no faith, that he was hiding in the bottom of a well, but he continues to put to the test the angel of the Lord. This is not a man who has faith. This is a man that it appears on the outside is cowarding to the Midianite army and hoping that this angel of the Lord will fail one of his tests so he will have an excuse to not be the one that God uses. How does Gideon go from a man of great fear, worry, and anxiety to a mighty man of valor and faith? The first thing that I find so interesting about Gideon's story is that when Gideon gets a glimpse of his future, it transforms him. I find it remarkable that the thing that empowered his leadership was not the signs and wonders. And they are remarkable. Fire from a rock, wet fleece, dry fleece in the bottom of a threshing floor. The thing that empowers the faith of Gideon is when he gets a glimpse of what his future is going to look like. He's still a coward when he crawls into the enemy camp and lifts up the outside flap of that tent to hear their battle plans for the next day. His intention is to get an upward hand on them by getting a sneak preview of what they might do. But what he hears from them isn't a strategy, but a promise. A promise that victory was coming to Israel. After all, why would they have any reason to lie when the lie would have been about their defeat? So he knows that when he hears these two soldiers predict the demise of the 300,000 and gets a glimpse of what the future of Israel will be like, he begins to live into the reality, not of what his current circumstances are, but instead is living boldly towards a future that he knows is before him. The thing that turns his worry to faith isn't his own gifting or even what he's seen. What turns his worry into faith is a promise of what his future is going to look like. The second thing that I think we learn from Gideon's story is that Gideon is told about his own identity. We have a couple things at our house that are high treason, meaning they are no-goes at our house. So one of them is, don't lie to me. Like, don't lie to me at all. Just tell me the truth. If you tell me the truth, the consequence is going to be far smaller than what they would have been if I caught you lying and now I got to punish you both for the crime and for the cover-up, right? So that's what's happened. The other thing is that we tell our kids all the time, listen, we're a tribe. And you three kids, your job is to protect and defend and be the best friend of the other kids. And so we don't tolerate our kids making fun of each other or calling each other names. And one of the reasons that we don't tolerate them calling each other names is because when they're calling each other names, it's never a positive vision of their future, right? They're always picking on them or calling them something that's unkind. And we never want our kids in our household to ever believe a lie about their identity that they learn by being called it in our house. One of the interesting things about Gideon's story here is, who knows what Gideon had been called throughout his life? He doesn't appear to be a person who is full of courage. He doesn't appear to be a great leader. He doesn't appear to be a person that, in spite of the circumstances, becomes faith-filled. As a matter of fact, the evidence of who Gideon is the exact opposite. So it's a profound picture when the angel of the Lord steps into the well press with him and calls him something that the evidence suggests contrary. He's hiding from the army, hoping to not be found out, when the angel of the Lord calls him a mighty man of valor. How is it possible, given the evidence of who Gideon is, that the angel of the Lord can call him anything other than a coward? Because this angel of the Lord is calling an identity out of Gideon that Gideon doesn't know is even in there yet. He's speaking something. In our vernacular, we would say he's blessing him with something that Gideon doesn't yet believe. We don't get to tell each other who we are. The only one that gets to name us is the one that's claimed us. Gideon gets a glimpse of his future when he looks under the flap of that tent. And then for the first time, does the reality of what that angel of the Lord called him begin to come into full vision. The future that was before him reminded him of what his identity was. Gideon, more than any person in Scripture, is an illustration of just how deeply this truth holds in Christianity. That God does not call the qualified. God qualifies the called. There's nothing unique about Gideon except that God called him and God named him and God gave him a glimpse of his future victory. And then and only then is Gideon able to set his mind on peace. This story ends as he stands before the Midianite with this phrase, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." That was the proclamation that the Israelites made as they looked down into the valley at the 300,000 troops. A sword for the Lord and for Gideon. That's good company for Gideon here at the end of his story. The guy who was hiding in the bottom of the press now is being accompanied by the sword of the Lord. A future promise and a current belief changed his expectations and turned his mind to peace. When he stands on the top of the hill and looks down on the Midianite army, he does with the peace of the Lord, because what the Lord has shown him already. Because his expectations changed, his worry was replaced by peace. Several weeks ago, I was running late for a flight, and in doing so, I forgot to take the small iPad I travel with out of my bag. And so it goes through the x-ray machine, and they pull my bag out, and they take the iPad back, and I'm not sure where it went, but it didn't get back in my bag. And we were looking around, and They got convinced because they were convinced at TSA that it wasn't their problem, that somebody accidentally picked up my iPad and took it with them. So they made an announcement, but I'm like 5 minutes from missing the flight. And so I'm like, listen, I've just got to go. And they're like, we'll try to find it. And if we find it, we'll put it in lost and found. It'll be for you when you come back on Wednesday. I was like, yeah, right. Somebody taking that to their house. I know it for sure. The problem is that this is a really important iPad. I mean, not only does it have like all the pictures of my kids on it, but it had like the materials I was using in California to work with. It had my sermon for Sunday when I got there, and it was gone. So I was just trying to figure out how am I going to get paper copies of all this stuff in. And so I go out and I work for several days, and I fly back on Wednesday, and I get back at like 9:30 in the morning because I do this dumb thing where I red eye back. That's a bad idea. Just sleep poorly on the plane. I fell asleep on the plane while I woke up with my arm a little wet because a lady next to me fell asleep on my arm and drooled down my sleeve a little bit. We're a new kind of friend now. And so I was like, I need to go home and take a bath and wash this lady off my arm. But I was like, you know what? I'm going to go and check and see if maybe it isn't lost and found. So I went to my airline gate and I said, where's lost and found? And they said, well, lost and found is up at information desk 1. Now, I number that because there's going to be more than one in the story. So I go to information desk 1, and Clive, who's working there, very nice, Clive says, we don't have lost and found here. I said, well, great, where do they have lost and found? He said, well, lost and found is usually kept at TSA. So I said, great. So I go back over to TSA, but you can't go back into TSA unless you have a ticket. So I had to wave down a guy and make him come over. And I'm talking to him, and I said, I've lost my iPad when I was here on Saturday. And he said, oh, we only keep things here for one day. And after one day, we send them to the office of the airport. Okay, so I've been to Information Desk 1, I've been to TSA, I now go to the offices of the airport. And so I go to the office, there's a very nice lady there, and I said, I hear that lost and found here is here. And she said, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, yes, the airline sent me to TSA, TSA sent me here, and she said, we don't have lost and found here. Maybe you should go downstairs to Information Desk 2 and see if they have it. So I go downstairs. The whole time I'm carrying my bag, my suitcase, and the drool arm all over the airport. So I'm back down to Information Desk 2. There's nobody there, so I wait for several minutes. And finally it says you can pick up a phone and call. And if you call them, someone come down to Information Desk 2. So I call, and he says, I'll be right down there. This was Clive. I already had a conversation with Clive. He said, oh, maybe it's here. So he rustles around a little bit. He says, no. So he calls somebody at the information desk, and they say, TSA has it. Okay, so I'm going back up, wave down the same guy. The guy says, oh, well, maybe we keep it longer than I thought. Let me call the information desk of the airport and ask them. And I said, I just talked to that lady. She has no idea what you're talking about. He says, let me think. So finally, he says, well, there's a TSA office here. You should go ask them. That would have been incredibly helpful 35 minutes earlier. You go down, you don't even know that the office is there. It's a secret hidden door, painted the same color as the wall, in between the drink machines, no sign at all. I ring a doorbell thinking that maybe someone can be helpful. No one is helpful because no one ever comes to the door. So I go back up to the TSA guy, and he says, oh, I forgot, they don't actually open until 11 o'clock. It's a great job that your office doesn't open until 11. Also closes at 2, just so you know. That's a great job. So I waited outside, sat on the floor. Finally, this lady comes out, and she says, what are you looking for? And I said, I lost an iPad. Have no idea where. She says, oh, well, lost and found's right here. Oh, thank you so much. So she goes in, and she pulls up some stuff, and she comes up with my iPad. It's a miracle. It's a resurrection-sized miracle. She has it, and she says, I'm going to need you to put your code into it. And I said, I left it here on Saturday. There's no battery in it, so we have to go get my bag, charge it up so I can put my code in it to realize it. And then she says, this is so fantastic. She says, I'm sorry that this has been so difficult for you. Jesus gave me a lot of grace, and I said, listen, I had very low expectations about government bureaucracy in the first place. To which she says, well, I'm glad we could fulfill your expectations today. So I got my iPad back, and it got me thinking about the fact that my circumstances there were so much better because I never had any expectation that they were going to do anything they said they were going to do. I didn't think at any point the right hand was talking to the left hand. I thought at no point did TSA, the airport security, and the information desk 1 and 2, they were never talking the same language. There was never an opportunity where I thought, oh, someone around here knows what's going on. It was literally by the grace of Jesus that I stumbled upon my iPad by sitting on the floor and waiting for the office to open in its short window from 11 to 2 that day. And I thought, I'm not that disappointed because I never thought this was going to go that well. Sometimes I think we spend so much of our lives expecting for the worst thing to happen that even when something great does happen, even when God does come through, even when God does keep his promises, what we find out is that we spent so much time working up our worry that in those circumstances we can't even enjoy God's victory. Our expectations frequently control how we get through the circumstances that we're currently facing. We can learn from Gideon what it's like to know what our future looks like and to know who gets to name us. For a believer in Jesus, what fuels for us victory over our worry is that we know what our future looks like, and we know to who we belong, who gets to name us. We overcome our worry by placing our trust in a hillside. Gideon walks up to the hillside and stretches out his hands, and his enemies flee. Jesus walked up to a hillside, reached out his hands, and your enemy flees. Victory over worry for the Christian is rooted in knowing that despite our circumstances at this moment, we know how our story ends. And for the Christian, worry becomes wonder when we realize what Jesus has done for us. And by shedding his own blood on Calvary's cross, no one can make a claim on the perfect Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. And thus, no one can make a claim on children who are under that blood. I'm not saying we should ever ignore our circumstances or even be in denial about how difficult our season is. But the worry doesn't have to win, because Jesus already won. And the worry doesn't have to linger, because King Jesus has already called you his own. And that's the gospel.